The Iron Ball. Chapter 1. The iron ball scraped against the pavement with every step. Clang. Drag. Clang. The sound was common in this city, yet somehow louder than usual today. A man in his 30s struggled down the street, dragging a massive black iron ball chained to his ankle. It was larger than any other ball seen in the district. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold weather. His worn-out clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. Finally, he stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. He dropped himself onto the ground and pulled an empty pack from his pocket. He stared at it for a few seconds before tossing it away. Then he looked up at the gray sky. As usual. Nothing new. No job. No home. No one waiting for him. People passed by without sparing him a glance. Some looked away. Some stared at him with disgust. Others acted as if he didn't exist at all. A faint smile appeared on his face. He had gotten used to it years ago. At that moment, a woman walked past, holding the hand of a young boy. The child stared curiously at the homeless man. Then his eyes moved to the enormous iron ball dragging behind him. He stopped walking. "Mom! Why is his ball so big?" The woman quickly pulled him along. Without looking at the man, she replied, "If you keep misbehaving and don't listen, you'll end up just like him." The boy glanced back one last time before continuing down the street. The man remained silent. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sad. Instead, he let out a short laugh. A bitter one. Then the smile faded. His eyes lowered to the ground. Because he remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. The same scene. A different street. A different time. But the same scene. Back then, he had been the child. Holding his mother's hand. Looking at another homeless man dragging an iron ball behind him. He had asked the exact same question. And received the exact same answer. If you don't behave, you'll end up like him. The man slowly closed his eyes. Then muttered to himself, "The funny thing is, I wasn't even a bad kid." A moment of silence passed. And yet, I still ended up here. A cold wind swept through the streets. The chain wrapped around his ankle rattled softly. Clink. 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 The sound reminded him that another day of carrying the ball had begun. He looked up again and watched the crowded street. Life continued moving as if it had never learned how to stop. But for him, life had stopped a long time ago. It was no longer about hunger or poverty. Even if he found a job. Even if he got a house. Even if his iron ball disappeared tomorrow. He no longer had the strength to start over. It felt as though something inside him had broken years ago. And could never be repaired. He lit a worn cigarette and took a long drag. Then he watched the people passing by. A wealthy businessman walked down the street with ease. Behind him, 3 poor men struggled to drag a gigantic iron ball chained under his name. A rich woman sat comfortably inside a luxurious carriage while 2 exhausted workers pulled her ball in her place. A familiar sight. In this world, nobody escaped the ball. The rich simply paid others to carry it for them. And the poor sold their backs, their time, and sometimes their lives for a little extra money. His eyes wandered across the street. The baker. The police officer. The construction worker. The teacher. The beggar. Everyone dragged a ball behind them. Some were small. Some were large. Some were so massive that their owners could barely stand. Everyone, without exception, except children and animals. He had never seen a child carrying a ball. Nor had he ever seen a dog, a cat, or even a bird dragging a chain behind it. It was so natural that nobody questioned it. Just as nobody questioned why the sun rose every morning. He exhaled a cloud of smoke and let out a bitter chuckle. Then he looked at a group of children running freely through the street. "Enjoy it while you can," he muttered. "Because it's coming for all of you." A shadow fell over him. He slowly raised his head. Another homeless man was walking past. His beard was unkempt, his clothes were filthy, and his eyes carried the same exhaustion found in the faces of countless people across the city. Yet there was one thing different about him. The massive iron ball chained to his ankle wasn't touching the ground. It floated quietly behind him, hovering several inches above the pavement. No scraping. No dragging. No weight. The man smiled. "Bad day?" The homeless man sitting on the sidewalk let out a dry laugh. "Are there any other kinds?" His eyes drifted toward the floating ball. "Looks like yours is having a better day than I am." The man chuckled and tapped his pocket. "I've got a few bubbles." He pulled out a small glass sphere, no bigger than a grape. A silver mist swirled slowly inside it. The seated man narrowed his eyes. "Back to bubbles again?" The man shrugged. "I never stopped." He held the sphere between two fingers. "If you've got some money, I'll share one with you." The homeless man laughed. "Do I look like someone who has money?" The man stared at him for a moment before smiling. "Fair point." He slipped the bubble back into his pocket. "Just one bubble can keep your ball floating for hours." "You walk like a child again." The seated man continued staring at the floating iron ball. "And after that?" The smile faded slightly. "After that." He paused. "It gets a little heavier." "A little?" The man looked away. "A little." Neither of them believed it. Both knew the truth. A bubble didn't remove the ball. It didn't break the chain. It didn't set anyone free. All it did was wrap itself around the ball for a while. It made it float. It made people forget its weight. Forget its sound. Forget it was even there. Then the bubble burst. And the ball returned. Larger. Heavier. Closer to the ground. And yet people kept buying them. Workers. Beggars. The elderly. Even people with small balls used them, afraid of what their burden might become one day. The man turned to leave. Still worth it. He wore the tired smile of someone who knew he was losing, yet couldn't stop playing. Then he disappeared into the crowd, his floating iron ball following silently behind him. The homeless man watched until he vanished from sight. For a brief moment, he imagined what it would feel like. To walk without the scraping sound. Without the weight. Without the iron ball reminding him with every step that he could no longer escape his life. He was about to look away from the street when he spotted a familiar face among the crowd. He paused. A young woman was walking down the sidewalk at an unhurried pace. An iron ball rolled behind her, chained to her ankle. It was neither small nor particularly large. Yet she seemed far less burdened by it than most people. She wasn't poor. She wasn't homeless. She looked like an ordinary person living an ordinary life. Clean clothes, well-kept hair, and a face that still carried something rare in this city: kindness. When she noticed him, she smiled and waved. Then she approached, carrying a small paper bag. "Hello," he answered with a slight nod. She sat beside him and pulled out a loaf of bread along with a few simple snacks. "I bought more than I needed." She said it the same way she always did. And both of them knew it was a small lie. She had bought the food for him. Yet he never pointed it out. He ate quietly while she talked about ordinary things. A new shop that had opened nearby. A merchant who had tried to overcharge her. A stray dog that had followed her through the market. Meaningless things. Unimportant things. And yet he listened carefully. Because she was one of the few people who still spoke to him as if he were a human being. Not as a warning for children. Not as a burden on society. Not as an example of what others might become someday. Just a person. And sometimes, that alone was enough. When she finally stood to leave, he thanked her softly. She smiled. Then disappeared back into the flow of people. He watched until she vanished into the crowd. Then he let out a slow breath. He knew the truth. He knew they weren't friends. He knew she didn't think about him when she returned home. He knew she probably helped dozens of people just like him. She was simply a kind person. And he was a very lonely man. When a person spends enough time alone, the mind begins to create stories that don't exist. Sometimes he imagined they were friends. Sometimes he imagined that someone finally cared about him. Sometimes he imagined an entire life that existed nowhere except inside his own head. Then reality would return. The cold sidewalk. His worn-out clothes. And the massive iron ball chained to his ankle. Even so, seeing her was one of the few things that made his days a little less miserable. One of the few reasons he still bothered to get up each morning. And for a few brief moments, his iron ball felt a little lighter. After finishing the last piece of bread, he slowly got to his feet. There was something on his mind now. Something he wanted more than food. A cigarette. He scanned the street. A man was smoking outside a store. He approached him. "Got a spare cigarette?" The man glanced at his dirty clothes and looked away. "No." Then he continued on his way. A few minutes later, he spotted a young man smoking near a bus stop. He asked the same question. The young man replied sharply, "Get a job." His friends laughed. Then they went back to their conversation as if he didn't exist. The third time, he didn't even get an answer. The man simply cursed at him before walking away. He was used to it. He hadn't expected anything different. As he continued walking, something caught his eye. Half a cigarette. Someone had thrown it away only moments ago. He stopped. Looked to his right. Then to his left. Then quickly bent down and picked it up. He glanced around once more. As if he had committed a crime. Then he lit it. He took a long drag. And closed his eyes. A brief feeling of relief washed over him. A tiny comfort that wasn't worth all the trouble. And yet, he was grateful for it. As the cold evening air grew harsher, he decided to find somewhere to sleep. During warmer nights, he slept wherever he could. But when the weather turned cold, he usually headed toward train stations. Sometimes the guards chased him away. Sometimes they pretended not to notice him. Tonight, luck seemed to be on his side. He wandered through the station until he found a nearly empty row of seats. He rested his head against one of them and stretched out. The chain around his ankle rattled softly. The iron ball settled beside him. He stared at the ceiling and began to think. Was this freedom? A faint smile appeared on his face. People talked about freedom as though it were some lost treasure. But what was freedom, really? Were the cavemen free? They had no bosses. No rent. No bills. No work schedules. All they had to do was find food. And find a place to sleep. Wasn't that exactly what he had done today? He found food. He found a place to sleep. So why didn't he feel free? He remained silent for a moment. Then muttered to himself, maybe we're not slaves to one master anymore. His eyes drifted toward the iron ball. We're slaves to 1,000 things. Slaves to money. Slaves to status. Slaves to the rules we created ourselves. Slaves to other people's opinions. Slaves to the image we desperately try to maintain. I'm important. I'm successful. I'm better than everyone else. He slowly closed his eyes. For the first time in hours, he felt something close to peace. Maybe because he had nothing left to lose. Or maybe because his mind was trying to deceive him. Trying to convince him that having no responsibilities was a kind of freedom. A small smile appeared on his lips. Then he drifted off to sleep, while the iron ball remained motionless beside him in the darkness. His sleep didn't last long. A rough hand shook him awake. He opened his eyes slowly. A security guard was standing over him. Come on. Get up. He rubbed his eyes. What time is it? Doesn't matter. Out. He sat up with a groan. His body still felt exhausted. Looking around, it felt as though he had only slept for a few minutes. Maybe 2 hours. 3 at most. He got to his feet and dragged the iron ball behind him. He didn't bother arguing. He didn't have the energy. As soon as he stepped outside the station, the cold night air struck his face. He shivered, pulling his worn coat tighter around himself. Across the road, near the riverbank, he noticed the glow of a small fire. He walked toward it. A group of homeless people sat gathered around the flames. Familiar faces. Faces he had seen countless times before. Some were laughing. Some were arguing. Others stared silently into the fire as if watching their lives burn alongside it. One of them waved him over. Come sit. He lowered himself beside the fire. For the first time in hours, he felt a little warmth. The man sitting next to him reached into his pocket and held out a bubble. Here. He looked at it. I don't have any money. The man laughed. I found some cash today. Then he grinned. Think of it as a gift. He stared at the bubble. He had tried them before. Once or twice. But he wasn't addicted. Not yet. He hadn't been homeless for years like most of the people gathered around the fire. He still hadn't fully adjusted to this life. Or perhaps he simply refused to admit that he was starting to. He looked down at his hands. Then at the iron ball chained to his ankle. Then at the cold that seemed determined to crawl into his bones. He was tired. Angry. Angry at the cold. Angry at people. Angry at himself. More than anything, he wanted to escape. Even if only for a few hours. He took the bubble. And crushed it. The silver mist spread across the surface of his iron ball. Within seconds, it began to rise. Slowly. Then higher. And higher. His eyes widened. It floated much higher than everyone else's. Far higher. He looked around. Their balls floated too. But only a few inches above the ground. His was hanging high in the air above him, as if it had lost its weight completely. A strange lightness filled his body. As though something had been crushing his chest for months and had suddenly vanished. He stood up. Then took a few steps. Light steps. No resistance. No dragging. No metallic scraping following him wherever he went. For the first time in a long while, he smiled. A genuine smile. The others burst into laughter. Look at him. The bubble's still new to him. They laughed even harder. But he didn't care. For that brief moment, he felt as though he were flying. As though the world itself had become lighter. Behind him, two homeless men began arguing. You stole my money. No, I didn't. Liar. The shouting grew louder. But it all seemed distant. Very distant. His attention drifted across the river to the street on the other side. Then suddenly, he froze. A luxurious black carriage rolled down the road. And for a split second, he saw a face through the window. A face he recognized. Or thought he recognized. His heartbeat quickened. He staggered forward, staring at the carriage. Thoughts began colliding inside his head. Memories twisted together. Images overlapped. You. He muttered. Then his voice rose. He began shouting. Cursing at the woman inside. The woman turned her head. Their eyes met for only a second. A brief glance. Cold. Filled with disgust. Then she looked away. The carriage continued down the road. Its lights disappeared into the distance. And he remained standing there. Breathing heavily. Unable to tell whether the woman had truly been there. Or whether the bubble had already begun playing tricks on his mind. He woke with the first light of morning. The fire had died out hours ago, leaving behind nothing but cold ashes drifting with the wind. Slowly, he lifted his head. Some of the homeless people were still asleep. Others had already left before sunrise. He sat there for a moment. Then buried his face in his hands. Disgust. The feeling visited him every morning. Without fail. As if his conscience always woke up before he did. How did I end up here? When did this become my life? When did I start accepting it? He stared silently at the river. Then he remembered the woman he had seen the night before. For some reason, she had brought back everything he had been trying to ignore. She wasn't the only reason he had fallen this far. But she was one of the reasons his downfall suddenly felt impossible to overlook. She reminded him of everything he had lost. Of the enormous distance between him and everyone else. Of the man he could have become if life had taken a different path. Thoughts began racing through his head. Anger. Regret. Hatred toward himself. And a desperate desire to blame someone. The world. Society. Luck. Anyone but himself. He stood up. Clenched his fists. I'm going to change. The words escaped his lips quietly. But he meant them. This time, he truly meant them. He would find a job. Clean himself up. Stop sitting in the streets. Start over. He took a step. Then another. Dragging the iron ball behind him. Scrape. Drag. Scrape. And with every meter he walked, his determination slowly faded. Little by little. His thoughts drifted elsewhere. To hunger. Then to the cold. Then to cigarettes. Then to finding somewhere to sit. And by the time he reached the city, he had almost forgotten everything he had promised himself an hour earlier. As usual. It always happened this way. Every morning. He woke up hating his life. Promised himself he would change. Then the day swallowed him whole. And the wheel started turning again. He returned to the familiar street. The familiar sidewalk. The familiar noise. And sat down. But this time, he wasn't sitting there because he had nowhere else to go. And he wasn't sitting there because he was tired. He was waiting. Waiting for the kind girl. The girl who occasionally brought him food. His eyes drifted toward the street she usually came from. He watched every face that approached. And every time it wasn't her, he felt a small disappointment he refused to acknowledge. She was different from the woman he had seen the night before. That woman belonged to his past. To memories he would rather forget. The kind girl belonged to the present. A small part of his gray, repetitive days. He didn't know much about her. He didn't know why she kept helping him. Yet he had begun to wait for her. To wait for her smile. Her simple conversations. The paper bag she carried whenever she stopped by. He never admitted it to anyone. Not even to himself. But he knew the truth. He was no longer waiting for the food. He was waiting for the feeling that came with her presence. The feeling that at least one person in this world still saw him. Still noticed that he existed. And sometimes, that was enough. Enough to get through another day. Enough to convince himself that tomorrow might be a little less miserable than today. Even though deep down, he knew that this tiny piece of hope might exist nowhere except inside his own mind. He remained seated, watching the street. As time passed, he began convincing himself that she wasn't coming today. Like every good thing in his life. It appeared briefly. Then disappeared. But just as he was about to stand up, he finally saw her. She was walking much faster than usual. As if she were late for something important. When she reached him, she didn't sit down like she normally did. And she wasn't carrying a paper bag. She seemed a little rushed. "I'm sorry," she said, catching her breath. "I'm in a hurry today." Then she held out her hand. There was money in it. He stared at it in surprise. I didn't have time to buy food. She placed the money in his hand. Buy something for yourself. He looked down at the bills for a moment. Then looked back at her. His heart was beating faster than usual. For some reason, he felt this was his chance. A chance to seem different. Less pathetic. Less broken. Less like the man who spent every day sitting on the same sidewalk. So he spoke. Quietly. I'm looking for a job. The words escaped before he could think about them. She stopped. And looked at him. For a brief moment, he felt like a normal person again. Someone with a future. Someone still capable of standing on his own feet. He straightened his back and repeated himself with a confidence he didn't entirely possess. Yeah. I'm looking for work. As though he were doing society a favor. As though he hadn't spent months sleeping in stations and on sidewalks. She studied him for a few seconds. Then smiled. A genuine smile this time. The kind that was rare. Are you serious? Yes. The answer came instantly. Without hesitation. For a moment, he almost believed himself. Her smile widened. I think I can help you. His heartbeat quickened. Really? She nodded. Yes. Then she glanced at the watch on her wrist. The urgency returned to her face. But not right now. She took a step backward. Let's talk about it tomorrow. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. Tomorrow. For the first time in a long while, he had a real reason to look forward to tomorrow. He watched her disappear into the crowd. Then looked down at the money in his hand. Without realizing it, a small smile appeared on his face. And for the first time in months, the iron ball behind him felt a little lighter. The moment she disappeared into the crowd, his heart began racing. Tomorrow. It was such a simple word. Yet it was enough to ignite something inside him. He stood there for a few moments. Then began walking aimlessly through the city. A foolish smile stretched across his face. He knew it was only a job opportunity. Just a simple conversation. But his mind wasn't interested in reality. His mind was busy with something else entirely. Possibilities. Endless possibilities. Ridiculous ones. Unrealistic ones. Yet he couldn't stop them. What if he got the job? What if he managed to keep it? What if she started seeing him differently? What if? He laughed to himself. Then kept walking. His imagination drifted farther and farther from reality. He pictured himself wearing clean clothes. Talking to her every day. Sharing meals together. Then his thoughts became even more absurd. He started thinking of names for children who didn't exist. A life that had never happened. A future that lived nowhere except inside his head. But he didn't care. When was the last time he had been excited about something? When was the last time he had looked forward to tomorrow? When was the last time he had smiled like this? He glanced at the iron ball behind him. It was still enormous. But somehow it felt lighter than before. Much lighter. As if hope itself had reduced its weight. Eventually, he stopped in front of a small convenience store. He looked down at the money she had given him. It was enough to buy a decent meal. Maybe even two. He hesitated. For a single second. Then walked inside. A few minutes later, he emerged carrying a pack of cigarettes. No food. No water. Just cigarettes. He smiled as he looked at them. Like a child who had finally bought the candy he had been dreaming about. He knew it was a terrible decision. He knew he would be hungry later. But he couldn't help himself. After all, hunger was already a part of his life. Cigarettes, on the other hand, were one of the few things that could still give him a brief moment of happiness. He immediately lit one. Took a long drag. Then slowly exhaled. Closing his eyes as he enjoyed the small comfort. Completely unaware that his mind had already begun building dreams far larger than reality. Dreams that might one day hurt him more than the iron ball itself. That night, he sat beside the river smoking a cigarette. Another homeless man approached him. He was thin, with a tired face and bloodshot eyes that looked as though they hadn't seen proper sleep in days. The man pointed at the cigarette. "Give me one." The protagonist glanced at the pack. Then looked back at him. "This is my last one." The man raised an eyebrow. "You bought a whole pack yesterday." The protagonist exhaled a long stream of smoke. "Found it from someone on the street." Then he lifted the cigarette slightly. "And this is the last one." He was lying. There were still several cigarettes in his pocket. He simply didn't want to give one away. The man shrugged and walked off. The protagonist remained seated until the cigarette burned out completely. A few minutes later, he pulled out another one and lit it. He smoked in silence while watching the river flow beneath the city lights. Then eventually drifted off to sleep. He woke before sunrise. For the first time in a long while, he had something to look forward to. Something that made him get up immediately. He headed toward the river. Took off his clothes. And began washing himself in the freezing water. He shivered violently. But he didn't stop. He washed his face. His hair. His hands. Then stood there for a moment, catching his breath. Afterward, he began searching through nearby dumpsters. This time, he wasn't looking for food. He was looking for clothes. After a long search, he found a few old pieces of clothing. They weren't new. But they weren't torn either. He carried them to the river. Washed them as best he could. Then put them on. They were still damp. But that didn't matter. What mattered was looking clean. What mattered was looking prepared. What mattered was that she wouldn't see him the way everyone else did. He sat in his usual spot. Waiting. And waiting. And waiting. Until she finally appeared. His heart immediately began pounding. But then he noticed she wasn't alone. An old man was walking beside her. White hair. A thick mustache. And worn work clothes. She carried the usual bag of food. Along with a cup of coffee. They approached him. The girl smiled. "Good morning." Then handed him the food and coffee. After that, she gestured toward the old man. "This is Mr. Hassan." The old man extended his hand. Then looked him up and down. His eyes stopped on the damp clothes. "Looks like you took a bath." Then he added with a grin, "Either that, or you fell into the river." The girl laughed. The protagonist forced a small smile. The old man sat beside him and continued making comments. "Your hair is neat. Your clothes are clean. Give you a tie and you might become a company director." The girl laughed again. The protagonist understood exactly what the old man meant. The jokes were wrapped in humor, but they were still mockery. He ignored them. For her sake. And for the opportunity he hoped was waiting for him. After a few minutes, the old man's smile faded. His expression became serious. He looked directly at him. "All right." Then pointed a finger toward him. "Tell me something. What exactly do I gain by hiring you?" Silence followed. The protagonist looked down at the ground. Then at his hands. Then at the girl. For the first time in a long while, he felt the gap between their worlds. She stood there. With her clean clothes. Her normal life. Her future. And her dreams. While he was a homeless man sitting on a sidewalk. For years he had told himself that all people were equal. That money didn't determine a person's worth. That society was chasing meaningless illusions. Yet the old man's words struck somewhere deep inside him. Because for a moment, he felt smaller. Not less human. But lower in the eyes of the world. And lower in hers. He had always claimed he chose this life. He was tired of jobs. Tired of responsibilities. Tired of betrayal. Tired of disappointment. Tired of a race that never seemed to end. He wanted freedom. He didn't want anyone holding power over him. He didn't want anyone telling him what to do. But sitting in front of her now, he discovered that he wanted something else as well. He wanted her to see him differently. He wanted to impress her. He wanted to prove that he could be more than just a man dragging an iron ball through the streets. And because of that, he was willing to pretend that work was the most important thing in the world. The old man stared at him for several seconds. Then asked, "Have you ever worked a day in your life?" A slight tension formed in the protagonist's chest. Worked? Of course he had. Not only had he worked, he had been good at it. Good enough that people once respected him for it. He had a name. A place in society. A future. But all of that belonged to someone else now. Someone he no longer wanted to remember. So he answered without hesitation. "No." The old man raised an eyebrow. "Never?" He shook his head. "Never." It was a lie. But he didn't feel guilty. The truth was heavier than he was willing to carry. The old man studied him for a moment. Then laughed. "That makes things easier." He leaned back and took a sip of his coffee. "Because I don't have any respectable jobs for a man with no experience." A small smile appeared on his face. A smile the protagonist immediately disliked. "I can let you clean the bathrooms at my company." Silence followed. The protagonist understood the meaning instantly. This wasn't about the job. It was a test. Or perhaps an insult disguised as an opportunity. As if the old man wanted to see just how far he was willing to bend. The protagonist lowered his eyes for a moment. then laughed quietly to himself. The rich. They always believed they were different. But if their positions were reversed, wouldn't they do the same? Wouldn't they sit on sidewalks too? Wouldn't they drag iron balls behind them like everyone else? He looked up and glanced at the girl. She was watching him carefully, and he noticed something else in her eyes. Excitement. As if she genuinely hoped he would accept. As if she were happy that he had been given a chance. At that moment, he would have agreed to anything. Cleaning streets. Washing dishes. Anything. Not because of the job, but because of the look in her eyes. So he said, "I'll do it." The girl's smile immediately widened. The old man laughed. "Good." Then pointed toward the massive iron ball chained behind him. "Honestly, I would have hired you to carry my ball." He said it casually, as if it were a joke. Then added, "But your ball is already big enough." In this world, the wealthy possessed many luxuries. Among them was a special powder. A powder capable of transferring the weight of a person's iron ball onto someone else willing to carry it for money. As a result, some poor people walked through the city dragging 2 balls. Sometimes even 3. While the wealthy moved freely as if they carried nothing at all. The old man looked him over again, then wrinkled his nose. And besides, a grin appeared on his face. "Your smell isn't pleasant enough for me to spend all day around you." The girl laughed. The protagonist forced a smile. While somewhere deep inside, something cracked a little more. But like always, he hid it. Buried the humiliation deep inside himself. Alongside countless other things he had never spoken about to anyone. The girl laughed. The protagonist smiled a forced smile, while feeling something inside him break a little. But he hid it, as usual, and buried the insult deep inside. A place full of many things he had never talked about. The old man stared at him for a few seconds, then took a card from his pocket and tossed it onto the small metal table in front of him. 7 in the morning. He pointed to an address written on it. "If you're 1 minute late, don't come." The protagonist took the card. The company's name was printed in elegant gold letters. Something he hadn't touched in years. He raised his head. The girl was smiling. A simple smile. But it was enough. Enough to convince himself that everything would change. That night he didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he returned to imagining tomorrow. How he would enter the company. How he would work. How the girl would see him after weeks. How she would tell her friends, "He's changed." He laughed to himself, then lay on his back near the river. His dreams were much larger than his life. Much larger than his reality. But he didn't care. He arrived an hour early. He stood in front of the building. It was larger than any place he had entered in the past years. Glass. Metal. Guards. Employees in elegant clothes. He looked at his reflection in the glass facade. Used clothes. Torn shoes. An unkempt beard. For a moment, he thought of running away. Then he remembered the girl. And entered. The old man greeted him with the same provocative smile. "Excellent." He looked at his watch. You're not late. Then he added, You can still leave if you want. The protagonist answered, I won't leave. The old man laughed. We'll see. 10 minutes later, he was carrying a brush, a mop, and a bucket. He stood in front of a door that read, Restrooms. He kept looking at the door in silence. Then he heard the old man's voice behind him. Were you expecting an office? He didn't answer. Or a company car? He remained silent. The old man smiled. Then left. He closed the door behind him and looked at himself in the mirror. For a long time. A very long time. Then he said in a faint voice, just for the beginning. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. Himself? The girl? Or the man he once was? He started working. An hour. 2 hours. 3. His knees hurt. His back hurt. His hands hurt. And every time an employee passed by him, he felt their stares. Or maybe he imagined them. He no longer knew. During the break, he went out back, sat near the wall, and lit a cigarette. It was the first cigarette in hours. Yet he felt it was better than anything else that day. He raised his head toward the sky and wondered, is this the life they wanted for me? To replace one ball with another? To drag a different chain? One of the nearby employees' phones rang. The man began complaining about work pressure. About the manager. About installments. About his wife. About his children. The protagonist watched him in silence. Then looked at his ball. It was much smaller than his own ball. Yet the man seemed more tired than him. He smiled for the first time that day. A small smile. Dangerous. Because an old idea began to stir again inside his head. An idea he had been trying to bury. Perhaps he wasn't the only failure. Perhaps they were all like him. But they hadn't realized it yet. And as he returned inside, he didn't know that this small idea would grow day by day, until it consumed his entire life. Months passed. He now had a room, a job, a salary, and repetitive days. He woke before sunrise, went to the company, cleaned the bathrooms, returned to his room, slept, then repeated it all over again. At first, he thought he was approaching a normal life. Then he began to notice something strange. The more he worked, the larger his ball grew. Rent, bills, food, transportation. The money disappeared faster than it came. And a question haunted him every night: if I'm doing everything society wants, then why am I still dragging this ball? But one thing made him endure. Horror. The girl who brought him back to life. Or so he thought. That evening, they left the company together. She was laughing, talking about something trivial he didn't pay attention to. He was only hearing his own heartbeat. This was his chance. If he didn't say it today, he would never say it. He suddenly stopped. She stopped too. Looked at him in surprise. What is it? He swallowed. Then said it. I think I love you. Silence fell. For a second. 2 seconds. 3. Then, she laughed. a short laugh that escaped her unintentionally. As if she had heard something completely unexpected. He felt the blood freeze in his veins. She stopped laughing when she saw his face. "Wait," she said, trying to process it. "Are you serious?" He didn't answer. His answer was written on his face. She looked at him for a moment. Then said quietly, "I'm married." He felt the words hadn't reached him. Or maybe they had. But he refused to understand them. "What?" "I'm married." And she pointed her hand to a ring on her finger. A ring he hadn't noticed all those months. Or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice. He felt something collapse inside him. Who? Why did he ask? He didn't want an answer. But he asked. She smiled a small smile. "Mr. Hassan." Everything disappeared. The street. The sounds. The people. Even the air. He didn't go to work the next day. Nor the one after. Nor the one after. At first, they called. Then they stopped. In the end, no one asked about him. He returned to the streets. Returned to the sidewalks. Returned to the bubbles. This time, more than before. Much more. He just wanted to silence his mind. To stop thinking. To stop remembering. But every bubble made the ball lighter for hours, then it returned heavier. Larger. Harder. Weeks later, he was sitting near a wall. His eyes red. His clothes dirty. His ball floating above him, courtesy of the bubbles. He no longer cared. He no longer counted the days. He no longer knew if he even wanted to live. Then he heard a familiar voice. He raised his head. "Mr. Hassan." Crossing the street. The old man stopped when he recognized him. He looked at him. Then at the bubble in his hand. Then at his dirty clothes. He shook his head slowly. Looked at the floating ball behind him. A strange smile began to form on his face. Just another addicted failure. Then he continued on his way. Step. 2 steps. 3. The protagonist remained sitting. He didn't get angry. Didn't shout. Didn't respond. Just watched the man's back as he walked away. Silence fell. A strange silence. As if the whole city had suddenly disappeared. He could no longer hear the cars. Or the people. Or the wind. Or even his own breath. Only that sentence. Repeating inside his head. Just another addicted failure. Again. And again. And again. Then he remembered. The room. The work. Waking before dawn. The floors he had washed. The bathrooms he had cleaned. The money he had saved. The girl. Her smile. Her laugh. Mr. Hassan. Everything passed before his eyes in a single moment. Then he heard screaming. Distant. At first he thought it was part of the hallucination. But it continued. And grew louder. Louder. And louder. He slowly raised his head. Then blinked. Once. Twice. 3 times. People were running. Some screamed. Some moved away. Some stared at the ground. He looked at the ground. Then froze. Mr. Hassan was no longer standing there. A large red stain was spreading over the asphalt. Parts of his body scattered around it. As for the iron ball, it rested on top of what remained of him. He kept staring at the scene. 1 second. 2. 3. He didn't remember moving it. Didn't remember getting up. Didn't remember anything. Then he began to laugh. A small laugh. Confused. Disbelieving. He looked at the ball. For the first time in years, he didn't feel its weight. He looked at the ball. Then at what remained of Mr. Hassan. Then back at the ball. It was still. As if it had done nothing. As if it hadn't crushed a human being just seconds ago. People began to scream. Someone took out his phone. A woman put her hand over her mouth. A man vomited on the sidewalk. But all that seemed distant. Very distant. There was something else that caught his attention. Something stranger than the corpse. He raised his eyes to where Mr. Hassan's ball had been. And he didn't find it. It had disappeared. He blinked once. Then twice. Then 3 times. Nothing. No chain. No ball. No trace. Gone. His heart began to race. He looked around frantically. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe he hadn't seen it. Maybe. Then he froze. Because something else was disappearing. He looked at his foot. At his chain. At his ball. And slowly, the iron began to crack. 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 Then the cracks turned into black lines. And the ball began to crumble. Piece by piece by piece. Until it turned into black dust. And disappeared. The chain fell from around his foot. For the first time since childhood, there was nothing tied to his leg. He stood. Unsteadily. Then took a step. Just 1 step. And stopped. Nothing. No resistance. No dragging. No sound. No weight. He felt a terrifying lightness. An unnatural lightness. Then he began to laugh. At first quietly. Then louder. Then louder. Until everyone was looking at him. It's gone. He whispered. Then he looked at the sky. It's gone. One of the passers-by took out his phone and filmed him. Then another. Then another. But he no longer cared. He began to laugh again. Suddenly, he realized something. Or thought he realized. All those years. All that exhaustion. All those jobs. All those laws. All that fear. It was a lie. A big lie. He looked at the corpse. Then at the people. Then raised his arms. Look, he shouted. Look closely. Silence fell. Even those filming paused for a moment. He pointed at his foot. It's gone. Do you see? It's gone. His eyes were wide. Like someone who had seen a miracle. Or lost his mind. You don't understand. They lied to us. All of them. He pointed at the buildings. At the banks. At the companies. At the distant police cars. They made us drag it our whole lives. And made us think this was normal. Some people began to back away. Others continued filming. He was smiling. A smile he had never known before. The smile of someone who had finally found meaning in everything. Or imagined he had. And somewhere far away, police sirens began to approach. He looked at the corpse. Then at his foot. Then at the place where his ball had been. Nothing. He laughed. Then stopped. And suddenly, he ran. He wasn't running from the police. Or at least he didn't feel that way. He was just running. Running without direction. For the first time in his life, there was nothing dragging him back. The alleys. The streets. The bridges. All passed before him like a dream. He didn't know how much time had passed. An hour? 2 hours? More? Then he began to slow his steps. He raised his head. And felt something strange. This street, he knew it. He stopped. Looked around. He knew this street too. And this building. And this shop. A chill ran through his body. The past. He was standing in the heart of the past. He didn't remember how he got there. Or why he came. But his feet had brought him here. He raised his eyes. To the house. The house itself. He stood frozen. Then approached slowly. The lights were still on. He approached the window. And looked inside. His eyes widened. Step back. Then another step. Blood. Everywhere. On the walls. On the floor. On the table. Even the ceiling. He felt his stomach turn. No, he whispered. No. He didn't understand what he was seeing. He entered through the broken window. Silence filled the place. A heavy silence. As if the house had died. He looked around. Then at his hands. They were stained with blood. He froze. Looked at them for a long time. Then began to breathe rapidly. Did I do this? He didn't remember. Didn't remember anything. All he remembered was Mr. Hassan. The street. And the ball that had disappeared. Then emptiness. Complete emptiness. Sounds began to return to his head. Many sounds. Overlapping. Unintelligible. He closed his ears. But they didn't stop. Then he looked at the blood on his hands. Dipped his finger in it. And stepped toward the wall. And slowly, he wrote 2 words. Breaker of covenants. He stared at them for a few seconds. Then turned. And ran. Ran as he had never run before. Until the darkness of the night swallowed him. A month passed. The man had disappeared. Disappeared as if he had never existed. The police found no trace. No witness. No single thread leading to him. But his pictures were everywhere. On the walls. In train stations. On news screens. The news anchor appeared on screen. Authorities are still searching for the main suspect in the murder of businessman Hassan. His picture appeared. Then another picture. A large house surrounded by police cars. Authorities are also investigating the murder of a well-known businessman and his father-in-law on the same night. The image changed again. A familiar face. The woman he had seen through the car window by the river. The same woman. She was crying in front of the cameras. Authorities have not ruled out a connection between the two incidents. The news cut off. But he wasn't watching. He was in another city. A larger city. Dirtier. More dangerous. A city not ruled by the police alone, but by gangs too. Crime there was not chaos. It was organized. Every street had its owner. Every neighborhood had its men. That's why he chose it. In a place like this, criminals could disappear. And he needed to disappear. He shaved his head, bought cheap glasses, and placed a small metal bracelet around his ankle. From a distance, he looked like he had a small ball. Like any normal person. But the truth was different. There was no ball anymore. No weight. He sometimes woke up at night and looked at his foot, just to make sure that it was really gone. Then he would smile. He started stealing. At first food. Then wallets. Then bags. Then anything he could sell. And he enjoyed it more than he should. Every time a new theft succeeded, he felt like he was conquering the world. Or so he convinced himself. He saw himself as Robin Hood. Even though he never gave anything to anyone. He stole only for himself. But he always had a ready explanation. I'm not stealing. I'm taking back what they stole from me. And one day, he made a mistake. A small mistake. But it was enough. He stole a bag. Then sold its contents. Not knowing it belonged to one of the gangsters. In this city, some things are not to be stolen. And the bag was one of them. He was walking in a narrow alley at dusk when he felt someone bump into him. Then another. Then a third. He stopped. Looked around. 4 men. Then 5. Then more. He smiled. Looks like I made a mistake. No one laughed. The first punch came straight to his face. He hit the wall. Then the second. Then the third. He tasted blood in his mouth. But he laughed. The men looked at each other in surprise. Is he drunk? No. He's crazy. They grabbed his arms. Pulled him through the alleys. Until they reached an abandoned warehouse. They threw him on the ground. Blood ran from his nose. But the smile didn't fade. One of the men approached him. Grabbed his hair roughly. Do you know who you were stealing from? The protagonist slowly raised his head. Spat blood on the ground. No. Then he smiled. And am I supposed to care? Silence fell. Then the next blow came, harder than all before. He hit the ground. Felt something break inside his mouth. But he kept laughing. A short laugh. Then longer. Then longer. until the men became more annoyed by his laughter than by his theft. "What's so funny, you bastard?" He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his head, looked at the man who hit him, then at his iron ball. "How much did you pay to carry it?" The man frowned. "What? How much did you pay to become a slave?" Silence fell. Then another punch. "Hold his tongue before I kill him." He fell on his side, blood streaming from his nose. But he kept smiling. One of the gang members approached, grabbed his foot. He meant only to restrain him. Then he stopped, looked at the metal bracelet, narrowed his eyes. "Wait." He grabbed the bracelet, pulled it hard. It fell to the ground. Silence fell. The man looked at his foot, then looked again, then froze. "Where is your ball?" The protagonist didn't answer, just smiled. The rest of the men began to look at him, then at his foot, then at each other. One of them took out his phone, began scrolling through pictures, then stopped. His eyes widened. Impossible. He held the phone, brought it close to the protagonist's face. It was an old picture from the news. A dirty face, longer hair, but the eyes, the same eyes. The man slowly raised his head. "You bastard, it's him." Silence fell in the warehouse. Even the laughter stopped. Everyone looked at him. The wanted man. The killer the news had been talking about for a month. The man on whose head the authorities had placed a large bounty. The protagonist smiled. Famous to this degree? No one laughed. The door to the warehouse opened. A large man approached from among the gang members. Silence fell as soon as he appeared. It was the leader. He looked at the protagonist for a long few seconds, then said, "I could make a good deal with the police because of you." The protagonist didn't answer. The leader sat in front of him and lit a cigarette. "Give me one reason not to turn you in." The protagonist slowly raised his head, looked at him with arrogance. A look that angered the leader more than any insult. Silence fell. Then the leader suddenly stood. "Keep beating him." He turned toward the door. "But don't kill him." He left the warehouse to contact one of the officers he dealt with. He wanted to know how much he would get from turning him in. The beatings continued, but he kept laughing. Then he suddenly shouted, "You slaves!" One of the men stopped. "What did you say?" The protagonist smiled. "You are slaves." The men looked at each other in disbelief. "He's insane." The protagonist pointed at one of them. "Is this scum higher ranked than you?" "What?" "That leader." Silence fell. Why should one human have power over another like him? Another punch came. But his words continued. "Money." He spat blood on the ground. "Power." He smiled. "All illusions." One of the men approached him angrily. The protagonist said, "You are the ones who gave money its value. You are the ones who made the powerful by submitting to them." His words annoyed them more than his theft. But they continued beating him. An hour later, the leader returned. He was smiling. "It's arranged." The protagonist raised his head. With the police? Yes. The leader exhaled cigarette smoke. There's a lot of pressure from the wealthy. A large bounty on your head. Then he gestured to his men. Stop. The police want him alive. The men stopped. The protagonist's body was covered in bruises. But the smile remained. He looked at them and said, "Obey your leader, you slaves." Curses rose. The leader shook his head. What a child you are. Then he added, "Anyway, your head is worth tens of thousands." The protagonist smiled. Slaves of money. The leader laughed. You really are crazy. After a while, the police arrived. The officers entered the warehouse. One of them looked at his condition and said, "You left nothing for us." The leader laughed. "I saved you some work." He was placed in a police car. During the drive, the officers kept looking at his foot. No ball. No chain. Something they had never seen before. One of them said, "So the news is true." The other remained silent. At the police station, he was brought to the identification room. Behind the glass stood several people. Among them, the kind girl. Tears were on her cheeks. Her gaze fixed on him. The investigator asked her, "Is this man your husband's killer?" She closed her eyes for a moment. Then nodded. Yes. The protagonist noticed something strange. Her iron ball had become much larger than he remembered. Afterward, he was taken to the prison doctor to have his injuries examined. She was a beautiful young woman. She entered the office carrying his file. He sat before her, handcuffed. He looked at her for a long time. Too long. She felt uncomfortable. He said with a smile, "What a beautiful face." Then he tried to touch her hand. A quick blow came from the officer standing behind him. He laughed. "You still think these restraints work?" Throughout the examination, he kept staring into her eyes. As if she was something to study. Not a human being. In the interrogation room, they bombarded him with questions. His name. His past. His victims. His motives. But he didn't answer. He remained silent. Then he suddenly said, "I want a lawyer." The investigator looked at his colleague. Then both burst out laughing. "A lawyer? And what will a lawyer do for you?" He pointed to a screen showing surveillance footage. "We have witnesses. We have recordings. We have corpses." He received several blows. But he began to sing, "I want a lawyer." Then he burst out laughing. In the end, they tired of him and threw him into a shared cell. There was another prisoner, huge in size, sitting on his bed. He looked at him, then at his foot, and froze. "Where is your ball?" The protagonist smiled. "That thing?" He pointed to the ground. "Only for fools." The prisoner frowned. "Who do you mean by fools?" The protagonist laughed. "Everyone who still believes in this world." The prisoner watched him in silence. The protagonist sat in a corner of the cell, smiling, as if he hadn't been imprisoned, but had finally arrived at the place he had been searching for. The huge prisoner sat on his bed, kept staring at the protagonist's foot. as if seeing a ghost, or a miracle, or a disaster. He wasn't sure which. "Where is your ball?" he asked again. The protagonist smiled. "That thing?" He pointed to the ground. "For fools." The prisoner frowned. "Who do you mean by fools?" "Everyone who still drags it." Silence fell. "Anyway," the prisoner said, stretching out on his bed, "tomorrow I'm getting out. I won't stay here long because of you." The protagonist burst out laughing. A hysterical laugh. It made the prisoner turn toward him in anger. "What's so funny?" "That you think you're free." The prisoner sighed. "You're crazy." "Maybe," the protagonist answered. "But I'm crazy without a ball." The prisoner shook his head. He didn't want to argue. But curiosity began to eat at him. "What's your story, anyway?" The protagonist smiled. "I'm free." "From what?" "From the bondage of this world." The prisoner laughed. "This is the first time I've heard a homeless murderer talk like a philosopher." The protagonist pointed at his ball. "Look at it." "So what about it? How many years of your life has it wasted?" The prisoner didn't answer. "How many times have you done things you didn't want because of it?" "Everyone does that." "Exactly." The protagonist moved closer. "And that's the problem." The prisoner laughed. "So what's the solution?" "Freedom." A beautiful word. Actually real. "And are you free now?" The protagonist looked at his foot. Then smiled. "For the first time." The prisoner shook his head. "All right, wise guy. If everyone becomes free like you say, who will grow the food? Who will build the houses? Who will make the electricity? Who will protect the people?" Silence fell. Then the protagonist said, "That's because you think like a slave." The prisoner frowned. "What does that mean?" "You think humans only move if they're forced." "Because that's what you learned." "From the state." "From money." "From those in power." The prisoner laughed. "Even if you brought everything down, new groups would emerge. New gangs. New leaders. And everything would start again." The protagonist thought for a moment. Then said, "Then we must eliminate the idea of leaders altogether." The prisoner looked at him as if hearing a child speak. "And how will you do that?" "Make people see the truth." "What truth?" The protagonist raised his foot. "That this is not natural." The prisoner looked at his own ball. Then at the protagonist's foot. For the first time since the conversation began, he didn't have a quick answer. The protagonist seized his silence. "Join me." The prisoner burst out laughing. "Join what?" "The revolution." "What revolution?" "The revolution of freedom." "How many people are in it?" The protagonist smiled. "Many." "How many?" "Every person who takes a step toward their freedom." The prisoner stared at him. Then said, "So you have no one?" The protagonist smiled. "Not yet." Silence filled the cell. The prisoner was convinced he was crazy. But something in his words was disturbing. Disturbing because it made him think. And that was the worst thing one person could do to another. to make him doubt the things he had considered natural his whole life. Outside, the sounds of the prison were slowly dying down. Inside the cell, a man without a ball was building the first followers of his revolution. Even if neither of them realized it yet. Morning came. The huge prisoner woke first. He looked at the opposite bed. He expected to find the crazy man asleep. But he found him sitting. In the same place. Staring into space. As if he hadn't moved all night. "Didn't you sleep?" The protagonist looked at him. "I slept." "When?" "I don't know." The prisoner shook his head. "You're strange." The protagonist smiled. "And you're a slave." The prisoner sighed. "Here we go again." The cell door opened. The guard stood there. "You." He pointed at the huge prisoner. "Out." The prisoner smiled. "I told you." He gathered his few belongings. Then looked at the protagonist. "I hope I never see you again." The protagonist laughed. "You will see me." "Impossible." "You will see me." He repeated it with strange confidence. The prisoner shrugged. And left. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. About an hour later, the door opened again. A well-dressed man entered, carrying a leather bag. He looked around uncomfortably. Then sat in front of the protagonist. "I'm the lawyer the state has appointed for you." The protagonist smiled. "So they finally sent me a dog." The lawyer's smile froze. "What? Don't you do what your masters ask?" "I'm here to help you." The protagonist burst out laughing. "Who are you to help me?" "If you cooperate, we might." "Might what?" the protagonist interrupted. "Prove I didn't kill them? Or that I'm crazy? Or that I'm a victim of society?" The lawyer fell silent. "Listen," he said quietly. "If you don't cooperate, you'll destroy yourself." The protagonist answered immediately. "I destroyed myself a long time ago." Silence fell. For the first time, the lawyer felt he wasn't speaking with an ordinary criminal, but with someone who no longer cared about the outcome at all. And that was more dangerous. "At least tell me," the lawyer said. "Why did you do it?" The protagonist raised his head. Then smiled. "Because I am free." The lawyer kept looking at him. Several seconds. Then he closed his file. Stood. Headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned to the guard. And said in a low voice, "He needs to be seen by a psychiatrist." Immediately. The door closed. Silence returned. The protagonist began to laugh. A faint laugh. Then louder. Then louder. Until it filled the entire cell. Elsewhere in the prison, the huge prisoner was signing his release papers. He suddenly raised his head. As if he heard the laugh from afar. He remembered the previous night's conversation. Remembered the foot without a ball. And for the first time, he felt uneasy. Not because of the man, but because of one thought. What if that crazy man actually believed every word he said? The next day, the cell door opened. 2 guards entered. "Get up." The protagonist smiled. "Is it time for my execution?" Shut up and move. He slowly stood, then allowed them to restrain his hands. He walked through the corridors as if on a stroll. While the guards were more nervous than him, they stopped in front of a wooden door. The guard opened it. Enter. The protagonist entered. It was a simple room. A desk, 2 chairs, and a small window. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s. Gray hair, glasses, and a thick file in front of him. The psychiatrist sat behind his desk. He opened the file, then looked at the protagonist. How are you feeling today? The protagonist looked at him, then burst out laughing. That's your first line? The doctor didn't answer. How are you feeling? He repeated quietly. The protagonist tilted his head. And how are you feeling? The doctor was silent. Then said, I'm the one asking the questions. The protagonist laughed again. Of course. Because you're wearing the white coat. That makes you an expert on humans. The doctor began writing something. Do you feel remorse? Do you feel fear? Do you feel anger? The protagonist was looking at the ceiling, as if he didn't hear him at all. Do you hear me? He answered without looking at him. Do you know why you have a chain? The doctor's pen stopped. What? The protagonist looked at the doctor's foot, at the small iron ball chained to it. Then he smiled. Do you know why it's still there? The doctor didn't answer. Because you still feel. Silence fell. You feel fear. You feel anxiety. You feel the need for acceptance. You feel the need for success. You feel the need to be important. He smiled. That's why it's still there. The doctor closed the file. And you? Are you saying you don't feel anything? The protagonist finally looked at him, then laughed. A short laugh. Quiet. Annoying. I feel. The doctor raised an eyebrow. What? The protagonist leaned forward, looked directly into his eyes. I feel your slavery. Silence fell inside the room. Even the guard at the door turned toward him. My slavery, the doctor said. The protagonist nodded. You sit here. Every day. Listening to people's problems. Then you go home. Then you come back tomorrow. Then the day after. Then after that. And you think you're free. The doctor smiled. And you're free? The protagonist burst out laughing, until tears came to his eyes. No. He stopped suddenly, then smiled. I'm finished. The doctor frowned. Finished? Yes. He looked at the restraints on his hands, then at his empty foot. And that's the difference between us. You still have things you're afraid to lose. But I... He shrugged. I have nothing left. For a few seconds, the doctor didn't write anything. For the first time since the interview began, he felt that the man in front of him wasn't trying to justify his actions, or defend them, or even convince him. He was speaking as someone who had fallen from the world, and was now looking at everyone from the outside. After the psychiatric evaluation, a trial date was set. The report attached to the file said, after several evaluation sessions and direct observation of the defendant, there is insufficient evidence to suggest he suffers from a psychotic disorder or complete loss of insight. The defendant is capable of distinguishing right from wrong. He is aware of the nature of his actions and their legal and social consequences. His answers are coherent and logical, with no signs of hallucinations or delusions. However, severe emotional blunting was observed. The defendant does not display normal emotional responses to events that would typically evoke sadness, remorse, or fear. When discussing the murders attributed to him, he showed no signs of the usual guilt. He appeared emotionally detached from others and from their suffering. The defendant cannot be described as insane according to medical and legal standards. But he suffers from a clear erosion of normal human emotions. In other words, he knows what he does, but no longer feels about it the way ordinary people do. After the report was published, the controversy grew. Some saw it as proof he was a conscious criminal. Others saw the loss of emotion as another kind of madness. The court decided to proceed with the trial. But the case was no longer an ordinary murder case. It became the case of the entire country. Newspapers talked about him. Channels talked about him. Social media talked about nothing else. Some saw him as crazy. Some as a killer. And some as the first person to ever get rid of his ball. People divided as never before. Chapter 3. The day of the trial came. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, cameras, families of the victims, lawyers, and guards dragging their iron balls behind them with muffled sounds. Outside the court, the streets were crowded with protesters. And inside homes, cafes, and factories, millions followed the live broadcast. This was no longer the trial of one man. It had become the trial of an idea that everyone feared. The door opened. The protagonist entered, his hands shackled. But the first thing people noticed was not his face, but the silence. No sound of a ball. No scraping iron. No chain dragging behind him. He walked with a strange lightness, while the guards around him dragged their heavy balls. He stood inside the defendant's cage. Slowly raised his head toward the judge's bench. It was not a look of submission, nor fear. It was a look of murder. A cold, fixed look, stripped of any respect for the man sitting on the high platform. He stared directly into the judge's eyes. Then said in a faint voice, sharp as a blade, "Who appointed you over your fellow humans?" An electric silence fell over the courtroom. The court-appointed lawyer approached quickly, tension clear on his face. He whispered, "You're destroying yourself. Don't provoke him." But the judge had heard. His face reddened with anger. He struck his wooden gavel until the bench shook. "Remain silent, defendant. Otherwise, I will increase your sentence before we even begin." The protagonist looked at the judge. Then at the trembling lawyer. Then at the cameras lined up, broadcasting every detail. The look of murder suddenly vanished. A small, malicious smile appeared on his lips. "All right," he said in a completely different voice. "I'll play along in this play with you." Then he raised his shackled hands to his chest and suddenly changed his expression, as if putting on a new face. "I am innocent." He didn't shout it. He said it with quiet brokenness. In the voice of a wronged man who knew the whole world was against him. The trial began. The prosecutor stood. He reviewed the crimes, the videos, Witness testimonies. The psychiatric report. And the words written in blood on the wall, breaker of covenants. The case seemed closed. But the protagonist wasn't trying to win the case. He was trying to win the public. Every question asked, he answered as if performing a role on stage. When the judge asked about the charges, he lowered his head and said in a broken voice, "I'm just a man who fell, and everyone decided to crush me." When the prosecutor asked about the disappearance of his ball, he raised his eyes to the camera and said, "Perhaps because I lost the last thing that connected me to your world." The judge ordered the witnesses to be brought in. The kind girl entered first. Her steps were heavy, her eyes full of disappointment and anger. But what caught the protagonist's attention most was her ball. It was no longer the medium-sized ball he had known. It had become larger, heavier, blacker. She dragged it with difficulty, as if every step she took said something she couldn't say herself. The prosecutor stood and asked her, "Tell the court, how did you meet the defendant?" She took a deep breath. "When I knew him, he was a homeless man. I pitied him. I used to give him food sometimes. Then I convinced my husband to give him a chance." Silence fell. She continued, her voice trembling between pain and anger. "My husband helped him. Gave him a job. Tried to get him off the street." She looked at the protagonist. "And that was the biggest mistake we ever made." The prosecutor asked, "How has the crime affected you?" She laughed a short laugh, full of bitterness. "It destroyed my life." She pointed at her iron ball. "Every day I wake up and drag this, and remember that my husband died because of the person I tried to help." Then she said, staring at the protagonist, "I don't pity him. I hold a grudge against him. And I will remain so as long as I live." The defense stood. The lawyer hesitated. "Did you see the defendant commit the crime with your own eyes?" "No." "Then your testimony is based on what happened afterward." She looked at him sharply. "My testimony is based on my husband's grave." Silence fell in the courtroom. And between each question and answer, the protagonist watched her quietly. No remorse. No pain. Nothing. As if he was studying what a disaster had done to another human being. Then the second woman entered. The former lover. The woman he had seen in the carriage by the river. The whole courtroom whispered as she entered. The prosecutor stood. "What is the nature of your past relationship with the defendant?" She took a long breath. "We used to love each other." She paused. "But that ended long ago. I built a new life. I got married. I was happy." Her voice trembled. "Then he came back into my life as a nightmare." The prosecutor asked, "What did he do?" She closed her eyes. "He killed my husband. And killed my father." A heavy silence fell. She looked at him. "He is no longer the person I knew. Perhaps that person never existed at all." The defense spoke. "Was there an old dispute between you?" She answered bitterly, "Everyone has a past. But not everyone returns to kill their past." Then she turned to the protagonist. "I will never forgive you." He didn't answer. Didn't look away this time. Just smiled a small, cold smile, as if he had heard a line from a play whose ending he already knew. After the witnesses, came his turn. The judge said, "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" The protagonist stood. Complete silence fell. He looked at the judge, then at the kind girl, then at his former lover. Then slowly, he turned his face toward the camera lenses, toward the millions behind the screens. And here, his voice changed. It was no longer sarcastic, no longer provocative. It became warm, sad, deep. The voice of a man who knew where to press on the wound. I am not here to defend myself. Silence fell. You are not trying me because I killed. You are trying me because I fell. Because I was the man who slept in the street, so you use me to scare your children. Because I was the image that makes you say, we are better off. He looked at the camera. But the truth is, the difference between you and me is less than you think. He pointed his shackled hand toward the ground. Look at your feet. Whispers rose in the courtroom. Look at the chains. At the iron. At the balls that grow larger as your fear grows larger. You say I am a criminal. Perhaps. He smiled. But you call your normal life an honor. When it is merely organized slavery. The judge struck his gavel. Stick to the subject of the case. The protagonist ignored him. He was addressing the screens now. Not the court. Every morning you wake up to go to a job you don't love. You smile at those you hate. You pay debts you didn't choose. You stay silent so you won't lose your salaries. And you drag your balls while saying, this is life. He lowered his voice. But it is not life. It is an open prison. Silence fell. Even the judge paused for a moment before striking his gavel again. The protagonist raised his empty foot slightly, so the cameras could see it. I'm not saying I'm good. And I'm not saying I'm innocent. I'm saying I'm no longer afraid. And when a person is no longer afraid. He looked at the judge. Then at the courtroom. Then at the camera. Their ball falls. A chill ran through the courtroom. You are not afraid of death, he said slowly. You are afraid of leaving your balls. Then he leaned toward the microphone. His voice became a whisper heard across the entire country. Break them. A terrifying silence fell. There was no crying. No screaming. No repentance. Only a man without a ball, standing in the defendant's cage, telling millions that their locks might not have been locks at all. The judge struck his gavel violently. Stop the broadcast. But it was too late. In homes, in cafes, in factories, in the small rooms that light never enters, there were those who cursed him. Who turned off the screen? Who said he was a monster? But there were also those who slowly lowered their eyes and looked at their foot, at the iron ball chained to it. And for the first time, the idea began to grow in their heads. The first session ended. But the case was not over. After hours of deliberation, the judges returned to the courtroom. Everyone stood. Then the verdict was pronounced. The sentence is death. Silence fell for a few seconds. Then the courtroom exploded. Crying. Applause. Chants. And anger. The protagonist remained standing, as if hearing a weather forecast that didn't concern him. He looked at the judge, then smiled. A small smile. That's it? The judge struck his gavel angrily. but his lawyer immediately rose. "We appeal the verdict and demand a retrial. The case has sparked wide controversy. There are points that need to be re-examined." After a long discussion, a new session was set. A final session to review the sentence before its execution. And while the court prepared for the next session, the whole country was boiling. Clips of the trial spread like fire. His speech was replayed thousands of times. Parts were clipped and republished everywhere. Someone wrote online, "They want to silence him." The sentence received tens of thousands of shares. Another wrote, "All his victims were wealthy and influential." Then he added, "Think about it." Theories began to spread. Faster than anyone could stop them. He's fighting the system. He avenged the poor. He's the first person to refuse submission. On the other side, there were those who responded, "He's a killer. And insane. And it has nothing to do with justice." But every attempt to silence him only made the talk about him grow. In the poor neighborhoods, his picture began to appear on walls. In some alleys, someone drew a foot without a ball. Beneath it the words, "Freedom starts here." And in factories, and offices, and prisons, people began to discuss not his crimes, but his idea. And that frightened those in power more than the crimes themselves. Inside the prison, the protagonist sat alone in his cell. The guard opened the door. A letter arrived. The protagonist raised an eyebrow in surprise. A letter? Dozens of letters. The guard threw a pile of papers on the bed, then closed the door. The protagonist approached slowly. He looked at the first letter. It was written in shaky handwriting. "I don't know if you're crazy or not, but for the first time, I look at my life and ask myself if I'm really living." He opened the second. "I've been a worker for 20 years. I hate my job. And I hate myself for never admitting that before." The third. "You are a killer. But I can't forget your words." The fourth. "My brother committed suicide because of debt. I wish he had heard your speech." He kept reading. Letter after letter. Until the bed was covered with papers. Some insults. Some threats. Some admiration. But one thing united them all. People were thinking about him. More than they should. He picked up one letter. "Read a final line. If they execute you, the idea will not die." Silence fell inside the cell. Then the protagonist smiled. For the first time in a long while. He felt that his imaginary revolution had begun to leave his head and enter the heads of others. After the death sentence, the protagonist was no longer just a prisoner. He had become a symbol. Or at least, that's how some began to see him. At first, the letters were few. Then they became dozens. Then hundreds. Most were insults. Some threats. But some were different. Letters from people who felt his speech was directed at them. Workers. Debtors. Homeless people. And young people angry at their lives. And one day, a strange visit request arrived. The prison administration approved it after reviewing procedures. A young woman was brought into the visiting room. She looked nervous. Her eyes gleamed with strange enthusiasm. She sat behind the glass. As soon as she saw him, she smiled. A smile that made him raise an eyebrow in surprise. "I'm a fan of yours," she said directly. He laughed. "That's a bad start." She shook her head quickly. "No, you don't understand. Everyone is attacking you. But I understand you." She continued, "You took revenge on those who despised people like you. On those who thought money made them better." He watched her for a moment. Then looked at her foot. Her ball was lighter than normal, almost floating above the ground. He smiled. "How old are you?" She told him. Then she kept talking, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. The protagonist understood something quickly. She wasn't a fan of him. She was a fan of the idea she had created about him inside her head. And that was more dangerous. He leaned toward the glass and said in a low voice, "Do you know why they want to kill me?" She nodded. "Because they're afraid." Her eyes widened. "Of whom?" "Of you." Silence fell. "The rich are not afraid of me. I'm just a man in a cell." "They're afraid of what might happen if people start asking questions." She listened as if hearing a prophet. "Why does 1% own everything? Why do the rest work for them? Why do some humans decide who is the criminal and who is the victim? Isn't this a disguised dictatorship?" She swallowed his words without hesitation. Then he said, "If you want to help me, spread the questions. Don't spread my name. Spread the questions." The visit ended. But she didn't stop. She returned once. Then twice. Then many times. And each time, she left loaded with new words. After weeks, small groups began to appear. On forums. In streets. In universities. People discussing his ideas. People quoting his speeches. And people who had never read anything of his, but loved the image they had painted of him. The authorities began to monitor the situation. Then the decision came. All visits are prohibited. The news spread quickly and ignited the fire further. Protests emerged. At first small. Then they grew. Protesters held signs that read, "Where are human rights? Don't be afraid of questions. Let him speak." Among the crowds, a new word began to appear. Freedom. Then it turned into a chant. Freedom. 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 Not everyone understood the same meaning, but everyone shouted the same word. And one day, the protagonist looked out of his small cell window and heard the distant chants. He couldn't see the protesters, but the sound reached him. He smiled. A quiet smile. Because he realized something. The idea was no longer his. It had left the cell and was now walking alone. After weeks of protests, the final session was held. But it was not like the trials of the past. The press was not allowed in, nor the public, nor live broadcast. The doors were closed. Security doubled. As if they were trying a plague, not a human. The protagonist entered the courtroom, sat in his usual place, then looked around, smiled. Where is the audience? No one answered. The judge stood. He looked more exhausted than in the previous session. Many papers before him. More pressure behind him. Before we begin, the judge said, there are new charges against you. You are charged with inciting hatred, with inciting riots, and with contributing to the unrest the country is witnessing. Silence fell. Then the protag. Honest burst out laughing. Me? He looked around. I've been in a cell for months. If a man locked up is able to frighten you this much, then the problem isn't me. The judge struck the table. Be serious. The protagonist sighed. Then said, you're wasting my time. He looked at the guards. Then back at the judge. Where's the electric chair? Isn't that why we're here? Let me rest from your talk. Astonishment reigned. Even the lawyer closed his eyes for a moment. The judge seemed to be fighting to stay calm. After hours of debate, the judge called for a break. Then returned with an offer. An unofficial offer. Not to be written in any record, nor appear in any document. He looked directly at him. If you announce to the people that everything you said was nonsense, that your ideas are just the delusions of a disturbed man, that the current protests have nothing to do with you, then we will replace execution with 20 years in prison. Silence fell. The protagonist looked at the judge, then at the lawyers, then at the state representatives sitting at the back. Then he smiled. A smile full of contempt. Slaves of money. Faces froze. This is your offer? That I sell my words for extra years in a cage? He laughed. And you talk about justice. The discussion ended. He did not back down. And after long deliberations, the final decision was issued. Not execution. Not 20 years. But life imprisonment. Until the end of his life. The decision was simple. Death might turn him into a martyr. But forgetting is more effective. That's what they thought. One of the influential figures said during closed meetings, the public's memory is 3 days. They'll protest a little. Then they'll forget. Everyone forgets. And the campaign began. His news disappeared from screens. His pictures disappeared from newspapers. Programs stopped discussing him. In contrast, new topics appeared every day. A new crisis. A new dispute. A new scandal. Then voices in the media began repeating the same message: the cause of poverty is immigrants. The cause of unemployment is foreigners. The cause of the crisis is others. People were pushed to look at each other, instead of looking up. An old policy. Divide and conquer. But the problem was that the idea had already escaped. Escaped from prison. From the court. From television. And was now in the streets. In one of the alleys, a group of young people wrote on a worn wall, "Freedom is coming." Elsewhere, dozens of protesters chanted, "Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!" And the protagonist sat alone in his cell. When he heard the guard say to his colleague, "His story is over," he smiled, then looked at the wall in front of him, and whispered to himself, "It's only just begun." Chapter 4. A month passed. The protests quieted. They didn't disappear. But they no longer filled the streets as before. The news began to talk about other topics. And people began to return to their jobs. Exactly as the state had expected. The protagonist remained in his cell. At the end of the first month, news reached him. You have a visitor. He raised his head. For the first time in weeks. He smiled. He thought it was the girl. The girl who had been carrying his words to the outside. He stood. Walked to the visiting room. Entered. Then stopped. It wasn't the girl. It was the huge man. The prisoner from the first cell. The man who had once asked him, "Where is your ball?" They stared at each other. Then the protagonist burst out laughing. The first fighter of freedom. The man sat down. Shook his head. You're still crazy. Thank God. The protagonist laughed more. The man looked hesitant. As if he didn't know where to begin. Then he said, Your ideas have been spread. You crazy man. Many people heard your words. Many were convinced. But, he paused. Many have also started to forget. Silence fell. You will disappear. And your ideas will disappear. And life will go back to how it was. The protagonist remained silent. Then smiled. A quiet smile. It doesn't matter. The man was surprised. It doesn't matter? No. He pointed at his foot. At the empty place. As long as there's no ball tied here. I'm on the right path. The man looked at his own foot. At his ball. He suddenly felt its weight. The protagonist continued, I see it growing. Every time I see you. I see you moving slower. Heavier. Closer to what I used to be. The man frowned. I'm trying. The protagonist laughed. Most of you are like this. You believe in the idea. But you want someone else to carry it out. Someone else to sacrifice. Someone else to pay the price. Even freedom. He smiled sarcastically. You've turned it into exploitation. Silence fell. Then the man said, So what do you want me to do? The protagonist laughed. A long laugh. Then he stood up. Opened his arms. As if the walls had disappeared. As if the prison had disappeared. As if the whole world had become a stage. Join me. The man smiled sarcastically. Still trying to recruit me? Always. The protagonist approached the glass. Look around you. Since you were born, they tell you where to sleep. Where to study. Where to work. What to think. Whether you're smart or stupid. Whether you're successful or a failure. What your life is worth. He pointed at the ceiling. Even your dreams are categorized. Even your future is decided. Then they tell you, you are free. Silence fell. Do you want this for your children? Do you want them to drag their balls like you did? Like your father did? Like your grandfather did? The protagonist's voice began to rise. His eyes gleamed with familiar madness. Do you want your grandchildren to live the same way? Born with a chain. Growing up with a chain. Dying with a chain? He opened his arms wider. struck the glass with his palms. Come. Come change reality. Come break the chain. Come see what lies beyond fear. Silence fell. The man looked at him for a long time. Then at his foot. Then at his ball. For the first time since entering the room. He didn't have a quick answer. The man left the prison. Evening had begun. The sky was overcast. He walked in silence, not knowing where to go. But the crazy man's words followed him. Words he had tried to mock for months. But he could no longer ignore them. He arrived home. His wife opened the door. His children ran to him. He smiled at them, held the youngest in his arms. But something was different. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's empty foot. No ball. No chain. No weight. He sighed, then looked at the ball chained to his own foot. It seemed larger than before. Heavier. As if it gained weight every time he thought about it. He remembered his words. Do you want this for your children? He looked at his children's room. They were sleeping. In peace. He felt a pang in his chest. Did he really want this for them? For them to grow up. Then work. Then carry larger balls. Then pay larger debts. Then die. Only for their children to come after them and carry their own balls? He thought for a long time. Then shook his head. And what is the alternative? He whispered to himself. The state wouldn't allow a revolution. The wealthy wouldn't allow a revolution. The police wouldn't allow a revolution. The army wouldn't allow a revolution. Would he risk his family? Lose everything? He kept turning the questions in his head. Then he remembered something else. A sentence the crazy man had said. There are people who fight. And there are people who watch. Silence fell. He thought about it for a long time. Then felt uneasy. Because the question that followed was worse. If those who fight win, will I be like those who exploited their sacrifices? Will I stand by and watch? Waiting for someone else to change the world instead of me? He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He had spent years blaming the rich, blaming businessmen, blaming the government, blaming luck. But for the first time, he began to ask himself, what did he do? He remembered why he entered prison. Theft. Then another. Then another. He always said necessity drove him. That prices were rising. That rents were rising. That the wealthy were getting richer. All that was true. But something else was also true. That he had given up. He looked at the ball at his foot. Then at his children's picture on the wall. And suddenly, a question occurred to him that stayed with him the rest of the night. Why doesn't everyone start from the same place? Why is one child born with a small ball? And another born with a ball that nearly crushes him? Why are some humans born among millions, while others are born amidst debt and hunger? Why do the poor carry the rich's balls on top of their own? And why does that seem natural to everyone? He got up, went to the window. The city was quiet. But inside him was not quiet. He looked at his reflection in the glass, then at the ball chained to his foot. And for the first time in years, he didn't ask himself how to feed his children, or how to pay his bills, but asked another question. A question that scared him more than anything. Can I ever get rid of it? And he kept looking at his iron ball, as if it was waiting for his answer. The next day, he left home early. He didn't know where to go, but his feet led him alone, until he reached one of the squares. It was full of people. Hundreds of people. Men, women, young people, and workers in work clothes. They were chanting with one voice, "Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!" He stood among them in silence. At first, he just watched. Then he began to hear the stories. A man who lost his job. A woman who lost her home. A young man drowning in debt. A worker who spent his whole life in one factory. Different stories, but carrying the same pain. Suddenly, he found himself chanting with them. Freedom! Then louder. Freedom! A chill ran through his body. What was this feeling? It wasn't money, nor fear, nor obedience. It was a strange feeling. The feeling that he had a voice. That he wasn't just a number. That he wasn't alone. For the first time in years, he felt he was part of something larger than himself. And suddenly, riot police arrived. The chant stopped for a moment. Then tension began to spread among the crowd. He looked at the policemen, at the shields, at the batons, at the huge iron balls chained to their feet. Then he remembered the crazy man's words, "How can one human have power over another like him?" The question returned to his head, stronger than before. Who is this man? Who gave him the right to command me? Who gave him the right to decide when I stay silent? And when I speak? He looked around. He wasn't alone. He saw the same thing in the eyes of others. Anger. Refusal. Determination. They were no longer as afraid as before. And every time the authorities tried to disperse them, they clung tighter to each other. The rows of protesters began to hold together. One person lifting another. One protecting another. One shouting, "Don't back down!" Little by little, the riot forces began to withdraw. Not because they were completely defeated, but because the crowd did not break apart. And because fear no longer worked as it once had. And when the vehicles began to move away, the square exploded with chants. Freedom! 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 Strangers embraced each other, laughed, cried, sang, as if they had won a war. And perhaps they believed that indeed. The man looked at his foot, then froze. His ball was slightly smaller. So small that he wasn't sure what he was seeing. He knelt on the ground, touched the iron with his hand, then looked around. Some of the protesters were staring at their own balls too, with wonder and hope. He raised his head toward the sky and smiled. Perhaps the country had not changed yet. Perhaps the system had not fallen. Perhaps the road was long. But for him, This was the first step in feeling that his life was not just a series of orders and fear. And the first step toward freedom. Another month passed. The streets quieted relatively. The protests didn't end. But they became smaller. And the state became more cautious. Visits also became more difficult. That morning, the guard stopped in front of his cell. "You have a visitor." The protagonist raised his head. Smiled. Finally. He walked to the visiting room. He expected to see the former prisoner. Or a new lawyer. Or a desperate journalist. But when he entered, he found her. The fangirl. She looked more exhausted than last time. Dark circles under her eyes from long sleeplessness. She sat before him quickly. "I've been trying to visit you for weeks." He raised an eyebrow. "What stopped you?" She laughed bitterly. "I was arrested." Silence fell. "For what?" "For spreading your words." He smiled. A small smile. Then looked at her for a long time. "So you're more loyal than I expected." Her face reddened slightly. Then she began to tell him what was happening outside the prison. About the new groups. About the slogans. About the protests. About the young people quoting his speeches. About the people who had started calling themselves children of freedom. He listened in silence, his eyes growing brighter with each piece of news. Then he suddenly said, "I've finished a book." She was surprised. "A book?" He nodded. "I wrote it here." He pointed at his cell. "But they won't let it out." She sighed. "Even visits have become difficult. Everything has become harder." Silence fell. Then he suddenly said, "Marry me." She froze. Stared at him. Not believing what she heard. "What?" "Marry me." He said it as if suggesting buying a cup of coffee. "If you become my wife, it will be harder for them to prevent you from visiting me. And you can get the book out. And deliver messages." Her eyes widened. He remained quiet, watching her reaction. Then, she smiled. A wide smile. As if she had been waiting for this moment since the first visit. "I agree." She said it without hesitation. He lowered his head slightly, so she wouldn't see the smile that appeared on his face. A different smile. The smile of someone who had realized something important. He had been ready to die. He had even expected it. But now, he had begun to enjoy it. Enjoying the chaos. Enjoying the impact of his words. Enjoying watching the world move. All this, while sitting inside a cell. He raised his head and looked at her. She was talking enthusiastically about the future. About the movement. About freedom. But he was thinking of something else. For the first time in years, he felt his life had turned into a game. A massive game. And every decision in it opened a new path. He had lost everything. Then lost his life itself. But now, he no longer wanted the end. He wanted to see where the story would go. How many people would follow it? How many would try to stop it? And how far the chaos could spread before everything ended. After the visit ended, the protagonist didn't think much about the marriage itself. He wasn't a romantic man. nor did he ever believe in eternal promises. But the girl was useful, loyal, and believed in him more than most people believed in themselves. In a world like this, that was a value not to be underestimated. Before she left, he stopped her. "I want one more thing from you." She turned to him immediately. "Anything." He smiled. "Appoint a lawyer for me." She was surprised. "For the marriage?" He shook his head. "For other things." He approached the glass. "Tell him I want my rights." "What rights?" He laughed. "The human rights they talk about all the time. I've been in solitary confinement for months. They treat me like a plague. I want to live among the other prisoners. As a normal prisoner." She nodded enthusiastically. "I will." And she left. Days later, the lawyer arrived. He was different from the previous one. Smarter. Less afraid. He listened to his requests. Then began working. He filed complaints. Requested a review of his detention conditions. Protested the long isolation. Protested the ban on visits. Protested the exceptional restrictions imposed on him. But the prison administration wasn't stupid. They knew well that this prisoner was not like other prisoners. Every word he uttered turned into a slogan. And every visitor who left him carried a new idea. Yet, the lawyer had legal points that were difficult to ignore. After weeks of negotiations, an agreement was reached. He remained in life imprisonment. Remained under strict supervision. But his wife was allowed to visit him once a week. He was also granted conjugal rights according to the applicable laws. Once every 4 months. That wasn't all. The administration agreed to ease some restrictions, without allowing him full interaction with the rest of the prisoners. They feared one thing: that the prison itself might become the beginning of a new revolution. When the lawyer told him the result, the protagonist smiled. "So they are afraid." The lawyer sighed. "They are cautious." The protagonist laughed. "Caution is another name for fear." The lawyer stood to leave. Then stopped at the door. "Are you happy with the result?" The protagonist thought for a moment. Then looked at the small window in his cell. "Happy?" He smiled a strange smile. "No. But the game has become more interesting." The lawyer left. The protagonist was alone. He sat on his bed. Looked at the papers piled beside him. The first draft of his book. The letters coming from outside. And the reports telling him what was happening in the streets. Just 1 year ago. He was a homeless man dragging an iron ball across the sidewalks, wishing for a cigarette and a place to sleep. Now, he sat in a life sentence cell. And the whole country was debating his ideas. He laughed alone. Then whispered. Who would have believed that? Months passed. The freedom movement began to grow. Slowly. But steadily. The authorities confiscated publications. Closed websites. Arrested protesters. But every arrest gave birth to new angry people. And every ban created new curious people. The protagonist was still inside his cell. But parts of his book began to reach the world. Page after page. Sentence after sentence. His wife memorized them by heart, then passed them outside after each visit, until the movement possessed something like its own holy book, something they quoted in their secret meetings and wrote on walls. And one day, the cell door opened. A new prisoner entered. The protagonist looked at him without interest, but the prisoner seemed as if he was seeing a legend. Finally, he said in a trembling voice, "What? I finally see you." The protagonist laughed. What a bad start. The prisoner sat on his bed. But he didn't stop looking at him, as if being in the same room was an honor. "I'm from the movement." The protagonist raised an eyebrow. "Which movement?" "The freedom movement." He burst out laughing. "So it still exists?" The prisoner was surprised. "Exists? You are its leader." The protagonist laughed more. "That's news to me." But the prisoner didn't laugh. He was completely serious, even believing, in a way that frightened the protagonist a little. He sat close to him, then took out several folded papers. "We have a plan." "A plan for what?" "To get you out." Silence fell. Then the protagonist burst out laughing, until he had to sit on the ground. "Get me out? Why?" The prisoner looked at him in surprise. "Because the revolution needs you. The movement is waiting. The people are waiting. And the whole country is waiting." The protagonist laughed again, but stopped when he saw the other man wasn't joking. He believed every word. The prisoner began explaining the plan. Sympathetic guards, cooperating employees, secret routes, vehicles waiting outside, and a whole network of followers. The plan was full of holes, unrealistic details, parts relying more on luck than reason. But the prisoner spoke with absolute confidence. The confidence of a believer, not the confidence of a planner. After a full hour, he finished the explanation, then looked at the protagonist. "What do you think?" Silence fell. Any sane person would have refused immediately. Any professional criminal would have pointed out dozens of flaws. But the protagonist was neither. He had long passed the stage of fear, past the stage of calculations. He was living life as if it were a long game. A game he no longer cared whether he won or lost. He smiled, then lay on his bed, put his hands behind his head, looked at the ceiling. "It sounds like a bad idea." The prisoner froze. Then the protagonist continued, "That's why I like it." The prisoner's smile widened. The protagonist was thinking of something completely different. If the plan succeeded, it would be interesting. If it failed, nothing would change. Either way, he wanted to see how this phase of the game would end. One day before the escape, all the details were ready. The messages had arrived. The guards who would look the other way had been arranged. The vehicle that would wait for him outside the prison was in place. Even the prisoner sharing his cell spoke of nothing but tomorrow. "In 24 hours, you'll be free." The protagonist laughed. "Didn't I tell you I'm already free?" But that night, his wife came for a visit. From the moment she entered the room, he noticed something different. She was smiling. A smile he had never seen before. A smile unlike enthusiasm. Unlike admiration. It was quieter. Warmer. She sat before him. Remained silent for several seconds. Then she said, "I have news." He raised an eyebrow. "Bad news?" She shook her head quickly. "The best news of my life." Then she placed her hand on her belly. Looked at him with shining eyes. "I'm pregnant." Silence fell. For the first time in years, everything stopped inside his head. He didn't laugh. Didn't mock. Didn't give a speech about freedom. He just looked at her. Then at her hand on her belly. Then back at her eyes. She was looking at him, with love. Real love. Love he hadn't seen in a long time. He felt something strange in his chest. Something he thought had died. His heart beat strongly. Then stronger. Then stronger. And suddenly, he looked at his foot. And froze. There. For a fraction of a second. A faint shadow appeared. A pale circle. As if something was trying to form. Then it disappeared. He blinked. It returned. Then disappeared again. It wasn't a ball. Wasn't iron. Just a trace. A ghost. A memory. But seeing it was enough. He felt something he hadn't felt since its disappearance. Fear. He lowered his eyes quickly. Controlled his breathing. No. This is impossible. It was all over. Wasn't it? He raised his head. His wife was still looking at him. Waiting for his reaction. Waiting for his joy. Waiting for anything. But he was hearing another voice inside his head. A voice he hadn't heard in years. What if your life isn't over? What if you start again? What if you have something to lose? He looked again at his foot. There was nothing now. But when he focused, he could see the faint shadow. Too weak for anyone else to notice. Too strong for him to ignore. He felt panic for a moment. Then buried it quickly. He smiled. A fake smile. And said, "That's big news." His wife smiled happily. But he didn't know if he was happy. Or afraid. Or angry. For the first time since the ball had disappeared, he didn't know what he felt. And as she talked enthusiastically about the baby, he looked at his foot. And at the faint shadow appearing and disappearing. As if the future itself was trying to return. Night fell. The night the movement had waited for months. The night for which maps had been drawn, letters written, and followers of freedom had discussed in secret rooms. But what they didn't know was that the plan was never theirs to begin with. And that everything that reached them because the state wanted it so. The protagonist sat on his bed. The other prisoner was nervous. Checking the time every minute. "In an hour," he said, smiling. "In an hour, you'll be out." The protagonist looked at him. Then smiled. "Or I'll be entering a new game." The prisoner didn't understand his meaning. And didn't care. He believed in the plan. Believed it was the fruit of months of the movement's work. While in reality, it was a plan written elsewhere. And at midnight, everything began. Exactly as planned. A guard delayed. A door opened. A camera malfunctioned. A corridor became empty at the right time. Every step happened on schedule. With exaggerated precision. Precision that made the protagonist smile. "This is too easy," he whispered to himself. He didn't see an escape operation. He saw doors being deliberately opened for him. An hour. Then 2 hours later, they were outside the prison. Inside a black car. Speeding along rural roads. The prisoner beside him laughed. "We did it! We did it! Freedom!" The others repeated the word. "Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!" The protagonist sat in the back seat, looking out the window, with strange calm. Then suddenly, the laughter stopped. At the same moment. As if someone had given a signal. The men turned. Weapons appeared. Aimed directly at him. Silence fell. The protagonist looked at the black gun barrels. Then at the prisoner. Then at the driver. Then he burst out laughing. A loud laugh. Louder than the engine. Longer than necessary. The men looked at each other in surprise. "What's so funny?" He couldn't stop. He laughed until tears ran from his eyes. A laugh. I was telling him. Another laugh. He pointed at the prisoner. That this is a play. And here is the play. They grabbed his hands. Bound him tightly. But the laughter didn't stop. "Well done. Well done. You played your roles well." One of the men punched him. The laughter stopped for a moment. Then returned stronger. "The funny thing," he said, gasping from laughter, "is that the followers of freedom think they freed me?" Silence fell. He continued. "They think their secret messages succeeded. That their men infiltrated the prison. That they fooled the state." He smiled sarcastically. "While the state wrote the plan. The state allowed it to proceed. The state opened the doors." He looked at the men in silence. Then continued. "There is no escape this easy. Not in a prison like this. Not for a prisoner like me. Everything was arranged. More precisely than it should have been. Even the guards were playing their roles. Just as you are playing yours now." He smiled, wiping blood from his lip. "So this is the solution. You get me out of prison first. Then you make me disappear. So the state is no longer responsible for me." Silence inside the car. He smiled more. "Clever. If I died inside the prison, questions would arise. If I disappeared after the escape, I'm just a fugitive. No prisoner. No responsibility. No investigation." One of the men looked at him coldly. The protagonist continued. "Will you pressure me? Or kill me outright? Or haven't you decided yet?" No one answered. He gave a short laugh. "So you haven't decided?" "As usual. The executors only know half the plan." One of the men looked at him angrily. "Shut up." He laughed again. "Even that isn't your idea." "Is it?" "Someone above you told you, tell him to shut up." So you said it. Silence fell. For the first time, the men didn't get angry. They felt uncomfortable. Because part of them knew he was right. One of them approached him and said coldly, "The game is over." The protagonist smiled, looked out the window at the dark road, then said, "No. It's only just become interesting." Then he suddenly remembered his wife and the baby. For a fraction of a second, he felt something like a sting in his chest. He looked at his foot, at the place where the ball had disappeared. The faint shadow appeared again. Too weak for others to see. Too strong for him to ignore. Then it disappeared. But this time, he didn't laugh. An hour later, the car stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse. The protagonist was taken down, still bound. Pushed inside. The lights were bright. One camera set up in the middle. A metal table. Several men waiting. He looked at the camera. Then smiled. So we've reached the confession scene. No one answered. One of the men placed papers in front of him. You will record a video. You will say that everything you published was wrong. That your ideas were illusions. That the freedom you spoke of is impossible. That people must return to their normal lives. He looked at the papers. Then raised his head. Shoot me in the head and be done with it. Silence fell. That would save time. The men looked at each other. Then one of them said, "And what about the baby?" He froze. For the first time in years. He truly froze. What baby? Your baby. He felt his heart beat. Violently. Violently terrifying. As if someone had woken him from a long dream. He looked at his foot. Froze more. There was a ball. Not complete. But no longer just a shadow. A pale circle. Clear this time. Smaller than everyone else's balls. But it was there. It began to form slowly. As if something was returning from the dead. He felt heat in his body. Sweat on his forehead. And anger. Real anger. He hadn't felt it in a long time. He looked around in confusion. As if he didn't know himself. The man said, "Your wife is with us." He raised his head quickly. What? We told her you escaped. And that she would see you tonight. His heart began to beat faster. Faster. And faster. And the ball grew. Centimeter by centimeter. As if feeding on every beat. The men looked at his foot. Then at each other. Even they seemed shocked. So the reports were true, one of them whispered. The protagonist couldn't hear anything. All he could hear was his heart. Last chance, the man in charge said. Record the video. Or your wife dies. Silence fell. The protagonist closed his eyes. For long seconds. Then opened them. All sarcasm had vanished from his face. Turn on the camera. The recording began. He sat before the lens. Looked at it. This time. He wasn't acting for pleasure. But for survival. He said everything they wanted. That he had been wrong. that his ideas were illusions, that the freedom he spoke of was impossible, that people must return to their lives, that he was just a fugitive, that they should not follow him. Then they pointed the camera at his foot, at the ball that had returned, clear, real, and chained to him again. The recording ended. The camera was turned off. Silence fell. Then a side door opened. His wife entered. She was laughing. A light laugh. Relaxed. Without fear. Without tears. He looked at her, uncomprehending, then said in a hoarse voice, "Are you okay?" She looked at him, then smiled, a smile he had never seen from her before. "You fool!" He froze. "What?" She laughed. "I'm not pregnant." Silence fell. He felt as if someone had struck him in the chest. "What?" "I was never pregnant." Then she approached. "Don't worry, dear. I'm just doing my duty." He looked at her, then at the men, then back at her. And for the first time since his ball had disappeared, he understood the meaning of betrayal, and understood why it had returned. Because the problem wasn't love, or the baby, or the future. It was because he had believed. For just one moment, he had allowed himself to possess something he was afraid to lose. And in that moment, the ball was complete. The end. Final chapter. The fall of the symbol. The protagonist began to hallucinate. He could no longer distinguish between the faces of the men who had deceived him, the face of his wife who had sold the last illusion inside him, and his own old face that he thought had died long ago. They didn't kill him. They didn't need to kill him. They threw him in a distant place, on an abandoned road outside the city, and left him there as one leaves something whose usefulness has ended. The state no longer cared about him. It had gotten what it wanted. The video. The image. The confession. The clip was published everywhere. The man whom people had called the symbol of freedom appeared, sitting with empty eyes, repeating the words they wanted from him. He said that everything he had spoken about was wrong. He said that his ideas were hallucinations. He said that his dreams were impossible to achieve. He said that people should return to their normal lives. Then the camera was pointed at his foot. The ball was there. Clear. Heavy. Chained to him again. At first, many refused to believe. Some said the video was fabricated. Others said he had been forced. And some cried in silence, not because they were crying for a man, but because they were mourning a moment in which they had believed they could be free. But the days passed. And people get tired. The revolution that had filled the streets began to fade. The chants became fewer. The signs disappeared. The walls were painted over the words. And those who had spoken of him day and night returned to their jobs, to their debts, to their fear, and to their balls which had grown larger than before. On the internet, the comments began to change. What did you expect from an addicted homeless man? You believed a madman. It was obvious from the start. All revolutions end like this. Some read those comments and laughed. Others read them and fell silent. As for him, he wandered on unknown roads, dragging his huge ball behind him. Gore! 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 The sound returned. The same old sound. But this time, there was no audience. No cameras. No speeches. No revolution. There was only one man. A tired man. Behind him, a black iron ball. And inside him, a broken laugh he didn't know whether it was mockery of the world or mockery of himself. On a cold morning, a woman passed by holding a small child's hand. The child looked at him for a long time. Then he asked his mother, "Mom, why is his ball so big?" The woman pulled his hand quickly and said without looking at the man, "If you stay naughty and don't listen to me, you'll end up like him." The man stopped. He looked at the child. Then at the ball. Then he laughed. A short laugh. Faint. Then he continued walking. The end.